great. Chris, thank you. If you have questions, you can line up in the back here. You know, as you were all speaking, I noticed all of your programs are very data-driven, right? You all point to data to prove the results, and you know, there's this return. You know, competency-based education is not a new idea. It's seeing a resurgence now with, you know, this focus on ROI, return on investment, and perhaps more than ever, there's this focus on student outcomes. The Obama administration is pushing, you know, the college scorecard and cracking down on, you know, predatory for-profit schools that take federal taxpayer dollars but mislead students. I guess first, just a lightning round question. What's your graduation rate? And I know that's a complicated question because it's not, you know, we could track it different ways, whether it's 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. What's your completion rate? And what's the most innovative thing that you think you're doing to increase that rate?
I guess I get to start because I'm closest to you, Kirk.
Sure.
So one of the things that we have at the community college is we just don't define graduation as a measure of success, as the only measure of success. We have so many students that are coming back to just learn particular skills or trades. Then we also have students that transfer. And something I didn't mention before was that we actually have more students transfer from the community college to four-year college universities, not under guaranteed admissions agreements than under them. So if a student were to transfer before then, they wouldn't count as a graduate. I think that being said, I think our community college is in line with sort of the national statistics of about, you know, program place students that start. It's probably a little bit less than half that will actually complete a degree or be a successful leaver and transfer before that. I think what we're trying to do is just a renewed focus on student success. We have been integrating coaching models, which is sort of a hot topic in the community college, where we sort of identify problems before they happen, and we have coaches to help kind of lead students through that. And I think that's proving to be something that's going to be successful and that we'll continue doing.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Scott?
We do only offer bachelor's and master's, so we know our graduation rates. Our four-year graduation rate, or our bachelor's graduation rate, is about 43% currently, which is slightly above the national average. Plus, we know that we're on a trajectory to be well north of 50% by 2019 in our graduating class, and we see it continue to go up. And it does vary by program. So different programs across business, technology, teachers, et cetera, will have different graduation rates, but overall, that's kind of where we're at and going higher.
Great, thanks. Chris?
Yep, so our AA degree basic building block of our program is 3 years old, and so we're starting to see graduates, and we're trending somewhere in the 40 to 45% graduation rate on that program. And the BAs are only 2 years old, and we actually don't have good data yet on that. We have plenty of completers. We actually have about 750 graduates. So there are plenty of people who have finished in, you know, a year or less, but we actually don't have good data. Our projected, and this gets into wonky, our projected mean pace on the BA half is about 3 years. And the other interesting thing about graduation rates you have to take into account is what do people come in with, right? So if they come in with more credits, they tend to graduate more quickly and so forth. But that's where we are.
You all mentioned, you know, student reactions, student surveys. As a reporter, I'm always skeptical of that because it's, you know, you guys are commissioning the surveys, right? You're not going to roll out a survey that says you're doing a bad job. But what are you hearing from students? Do you think you could be doing more to serve them?
Yeah, in our case, though, we don't actually commission all of our surveys. So there are Gallup surveys that are regularly done. Harris does the regular surveys on student engagement. Gallup does a lot of surveys on graduate well-being, et cetera. And so in general, you saw some of the data I shared, but in the Gallup surveys of student well-being and the kind of 5 categories of student well-being, our graduates are at least showing to be twice as likely to be performing well in all 5 dimensions of personal well-being. So. That includes financial well-being, professional well-being, or employment, health, et cetera, social. You know, they are more engaged students because of the fact that they are often working adults. They are in family situations, et cetera. So there's many of those aspects that are already going versus an unmarried traditional 18 to 24-year-old college student. But you know, overall, that we track, even very specifically at WGU, we don't really track satisfaction rates. We track only very satisfied student rates. In those surveys, our trending data shows that we're consistently measuring about 60% or higher of overall very satisfied student rate. If you combine very satisfied and satisfied, then we're basically like 98% And it's really strong. And I think that's the case because, one, it's preparing them to pursue the opportunities that they believe the post-secondary education would in the first place. That is not common today in the U.S. I think if you looked at the data, it would say that, in fact, only about 34%, I think, of white Americans actually believe that higher education is a path to opportunity. I think it's higher among African Americans, it's 50%, and Hispanic Americans, I think it's 62% now. So it's a pretty low number that only 34% of the white Americans are actually believing that post-secondary education is a path to opportunity. We think that can be, we think we can move that number up simply because the ROI is more effective and more meaningful to individuals who are pursuing education.
Great. I wanted to, do we have any questions in the back? No? I thought I saw someone standing there. Okay. So I guess we've been looking very closely at the student debt crisis that comes up. We talk about the cost of college and trying to lower the burden. There's a debate going on in this country right now about the idea of whether there's a crisis here. I think Beth Akers is here. She was here yesterday. Sandy Baum have made the argument that this has all been overblown, that that the crisis isn't as bad as we've been led to believe. As people at the head of this, seeing students come through the door, do you agree with that argument? And is the crisis as bad as we've been led to believe? Chris?
When you look at, what is it now, 1.3 trillion in
Yeah,
student
the
debt?
total, right?
That's a lot of debt, right, in the economy. So you
Right.
gotta say.
But economists will say more students are going to college than ever before,
Yeah,
right?
but then you get to more nuanced levels, right?
Yeah.
Like how much of that debt is carried by people who dropped out and don't have the opportunity to be successful and get the gains from college? How much of that debt is, and this is something we've started doing at SNHU, is really looking at kind of debt to earnings ratios in our programs and really evaluating programs and saying, okay, well, maybe this program doesn't, starting salary is pretty low compared to the debt ratio that people have to carry. So I would say kind of yes, in general, that's a big load of debt to carry around, but then you look at it, like what are the various categories? People who go to college, get a good degree, or some of our older adults who go on and get their degree and move up in their career, that's a pretty good deal for them. And they're moving into a different category in the workforce.
Great. Scott, you want to take this one on?
Yeah, because it's the one I think that there's a lot of misinformation out there. I think first and foremost, I think it would be false to assume that the federal government doesn't love the student loan program. They love the student loan program. I don't know where else you can borrow money at 25 to 75 basis points and lend it out at 3 to 5%. And basically have loan holders that can't default out of the loans in any circumstance whatsoever, meaning they can't bankrupt out of them. And you're kind of like, this is a really good revenue-making machine for the federal government. And it's an environment, unlike mortgages, which was the previous debt crisis. Unlike mortgages, the reality is the federal government underwrites 90% of the student loans that are out there. So from their standpoint, I don't think they have any interest in addressing the cost of higher education because they love the loan programs. It's a huge revenue generator for them. They want to have more control over the institutions that are providing the product that they're underwriting for the students. From their perspective, I don't personally expect any significant innovation coming from them. I think they're mostly trying to add more regulatory constraints around who's actually becoming eligible for them, what are the money pathways that it flows from them to the students, et cetera. So they want to increase the quality of the debt that they're providing, but in reality, they don't want to give out less. They'd rather give out more. From a household environment, it's really, really, really damaging at this point when you consider the fact that school debt or student loans are now the second largest debt item on a household's balance sheet next to mortgages, and it's large. I mean, a graduate now, what was it, $37,146 average student loan debt of our four-year graduates this last year. And you consider that that's now higher than consumer loans for autos, for whatever else, and you're like, this thing's going to be with you for a really long time. And when people talk about repayment models of, oh, just give us 10% of your income for the next 25 years of your life, you're like, I don't know if there's a bigger tax, and we have the federal government to thank for it, quite frankly. So
Andrew, GBH polled about 1,000 adults about a year ago. We asked them, if you inherited $200,000, would you invest it all in a 4-year education or go to community college for a couple of years and save the rest? Overwhelmingly, people said community college option. From your perspective, the community college option in this country was always the most affordable option. Do you see this as a crisis, or do you feel like community colleges are still serving that purpose?
Yeah, I mean, I'll comment on those numbers, and I'm not really surprised by that. When I speak with parents and I talk to them about guaranteed transfer agreements in particular, usually the first question I get from them is, what's the catch?
Right.
It seems too good to be true. You cannot be telling me the whole story. Because to them, it just seems like such a rational decision and it makes sense. So I'm not surprised that people are sort of maybe a little bit removed, would make that rational choice, which I think is a rational choice, and attend a community college. I think it's hard for an 18-year-old sometimes to make rational choices. I have a 4-year-old. I know he doesn't make rational choices. I think, but I do think what the community college offers is important. And I would say in terms of whether or not there is a student debt crisis, I probably can't speak, globally to that, but I think, for a family that can't afford to go to college, that's a crisis for them. Mm-hmm. So I think there are individual crises happening everywhere, and I'd like to think that the community college can play a role in sort of reducing that for families.
I can make one more comment about that.
Sure, Chris.
I think it's a further level of nuance. I mean, it's really tragic when institutions go out of business, like the recent ITT network, and leave students with huge amounts of debt and no real transferable credits. I mean, that's like, we can all agree, right? That's
right.
A bad situation, and kind of somehow not enough oversight.
Right, exposes a lot of the failures in our system.
On the other hand, as somebody who's, working with the federal government a lot on kind of policy issues and innovation issues, the federal government makes it hard to innovate and hard to drive down costs and hard to look, because there's a lot of paperwork and there's a lot of regulations, and
right.
that very fact drives up cost. So I'm not saying less oversight, but somehow in there has to be more, I think, room for innovation and more and less paperwork and less regulation as well.
And I know your president, Paul LeBlanc, has been involved in that, going down to the Department of Ed, right?
Yeah, can I just add one thing to that? I think that there are parallels to learn from even what's going on in the healthcare sector, because the reality is that the payers for the product are not the same as the consumers of the product. And I think that's true in education as well, such that there should be more questions and more inspection of what's going into the cost of education. And is it more directly related to actually attaining the competencies and the knowledge and the cognitive ability that's very critical for the workforce development? Because there's no doubt that education remains the single biggest catalyst for individuals to improve their lot in life, to attain the opportunity that they want to pursue. But you have to consider, what are all the costs that are actually going into the product that we're pursuing, the product being the higher education degree. If you go look at the data, it suggests that, in fact, it's all non-education related costs over the last 2 decades. Administrative overhead, student life experiences, things like that. And you kind of wonder, well, if I were the federal government, I'd kind of be looking at that side of it and saying, well, what am I really funding?
Right.
And how do I maybe just fund those things that are more related to the specific aspects that contribute to the education and the opportunity associated with that, rather than what is more of a, administrative oversight or administrative costs, or it's student life experiences, whatever it may be. How do we get back to those that are really adding value? That's the same challenge I think the federal government's pursuing on the healthcare side, which is, what are the costs going into the provision of the healthcare? Because the costs are going up dramatically, and we're trying to figure out how to pay for it.
Right.
So,
the middleman in all of this is the accreditation agencies, and we've recently done some reporting on the accreditation agencies, which is like, death on the radio. It's the driest thing in the world, but they allow the federal dollars to flow to schools, that have poor outcomes, right? So, as what do you deal with these agencies, every day, or when you're trying to innovate? What's the role of accreditors in lowering student loan debt burden? And you all mentioned regulation and red tape. I'm hearing from both sides that we need more regulation. From you, it sounds like you all think we need less regulation. But if the accreditors, if the gatekeepers aren't, are allowing the dollars to flow to ITT Tech and Corinthian and colleges that have really poor outcomes and that have been found to mislead their students, do we need innovation in that sector?
Yeah,
I would say
we work with NEASC here in the Northeast. They're really one of the better agencies, I think, accreditors, I think. We've had very good relationship with them. Overall, I think there's a sense within the CBE world and other innovation worlds that, that accreditors are not innovative, that they're really, damping innovation, damping down on innovation. And I think they are starting to talk more about outcomes. I think some of the experimental sites and some of the other things going on are encouraging that. They're talking more about learning outcomes, graduation outcomes, employment outcomes, and so forth. But it's not really a core part of what they do yet.
Anyone else want to take that one on? I can't even see. Do we have questions in the back? We have one.
I would.
All right, Scott's going to add on that one.
Yeah, the thing
Sure.
that I would add is that I, again, be maybe more of a less regulation, or at least regulation policy environments that foster innovation. I think my general feeling is that accreditors actually are in a better position to really assess the quality of the education being provided than the federal government would be.
Right, and some bureaucrat.
And some, in a bureaucratic environment that suggests that, oh, there's one standard that we can apply to all. I don't think that's really true. And I think accrediting bodies can actually be really the standards of quality. Now, from an accreditation process, I think really what you highlight and I believe is that you do have to have an evolving balance between process and outcomes. You can't only try to regulate the process by which education has to be delivered. If you do, you end up stifling innovation. If you focus more and more on student outcomes and whether or not those outcomes are ones that are advancing the development of our workforce and our economy, whether they're advancing liberal education, if you try to look at the outcomes and balance that with process, then you can allow innovation to occur in a way that still gives some control over bad actors. They're, for whatever reason, they're going to be there in every sector, that their individuals are going to try to take advantage of the regulatory environment or the loopholes or whatever. But if you balance that with outcomes, I think you can get into an environment that fosters more innovation, not less.
Great. And please introduce yourself in the back. Tell us your name and where you're from.
How you doing? My name is David Vera. I'm from American Student Assistance. My question is, these all seem like programmatic approaches. I just wanted to get you guys' view on what you guys see as a national solution to be.
Great question. Who wants to jump in on that?
Well, I think I'm sorry.
You can go ahead. I mean,
Well,
you can take that one
I'm not
first.
sure I have the national solution, but I think what we were just talking about, which is really focused on responsible innovation, I guess is what I would say, like using technology in new ways, driving down cost, connection with workforce, and employment outcomes. Like there's a lot of pieces of the whole landscape that could be put together in new ways. Learning on the job. I mean, I think we're really starting to see this connection more with talent and workforce and higher ed, talking more than they ever have before. There's still a huge disconnect between the two. And to me, that's part of this solution.
Great. Scott, you want to jump in?
To my earlier point around trying to really figure out the fundamental challenge to this student loan debt crisis, when you have an institution who's willing to give plenty of loans, I think you then have to really figure out the source of the problem, which is the increasing cost. I think there is a potential model that says, rather than just telling individuals how much you can borrow, why don't we look at the costs that are more directly associated with the education outcomes that we want to provide? And is there a means by which, in fact, the loan models and the loan programs are more tightly associated with the costs that are directly associated with the education? And such that individuals have to figure out what are the means by which you're going to provide for the other non-education related costs, or the ones that are more related to living, or whatever it may be, such that we as individuals who are consuming education, we make more thoughtful decisions about what are we willing to fund for the opportunity that we achieve. I do applaud the efforts to also identify the outcomes, meaning what can you expect when you pursue different institution education as to the outcomes? What's likely going to be your graduation? How many students graduate in 4 years versus 6 years? What are the things that the individual as an input is going to change the cost such that we align the funding with the cost of the education itself? The other thing I would say is that in general, we have to give more information to an individual who's deciding the borrowing about how much they really need to borrow, so that you don't just take everything you can take, you only take what you need to take. I mean, just because you can doesn't mean you should. I do know that in my graduate education, I came out after 2 years with over $110,000 in debt, and you kind of wondered, whoa, if I knew that was the cost and I had to fund all that myself up front or something like that, you might think about it very differently. The other thing that's interesting is that there are ways to actually get that other free money. I think there are a lot of private institutions that would love to participate more directly in education loan financing that I don't know if they're scared of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau or they're scared of the regulatory environment or whatever else. It's like, I don't want to invite scrutiny, but I sure would love to actually contribute more to students who need to pursue education, and can they do it in a way through private funding the same way we see in the housing market, but we don't see in the student loan? How do we bring more private financiers into the student loan side that we don't have today?
Just to add
Sorry.
one little thing, I mean, I think we have to mention the role of non-higher ed opportunities for learning. I mean, new micro-credentials, micro-degrees, non-higher ed I mean, people will seek that value, and if it can be shown that those credentials lead to better jobs, that's where they'll go. And I think we have to look outside of higher ed for some of these solutions as well.
I think that's,
yes,
is that Bob from Boston?
Yes, it is.
All right.
So I'm Bob Hildreth from Inverson, and I just wanted to ask a question of each of you, if you would know the number. What percent of your total tuition comes from both federal grants and federal loan transfers?
Great question. Who wants to jump in first?
I don't think I know that exact number. What the number I know is about 2/3 of our students actually take on loans to complete their education with us. What percent of that actually is coming from those programs, I don't know.
So it's a combination of federal and state. You're not sure how it breaks down.
Yeah, and the state money is in our certain state affiliates, where we have state affiliates, our students can apply for needs-based funding and needs-based scholarships. But I think the large majority, it's probably federal money, not state money.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, do you know?
Yeah, I don't, but I will mention this. Students that are taking dual enrollment in Virginia are largely doing it at no cost. So right there, I would say that the percentage that's coming from federal aid is nothing. Students who are in dual enrollment are not eligible for any federal aid as of right now. There are some experiments going on. But I think, from that perspective, we're hoping that students can not only reduce the debt, but maybe not even have debt. And I think leveraging dual enrollment and other opportunities like that allows students to sort of even bypass some of the things that we're talking about and some of the issues. And hopefully, it sort of in reference to the question before about what a national solution is, I don't think there is a national solution. I think there are solutions, and I think that there are people doing work. Right now, some of that work is on the edges, but I think hopefully that kind of proliferates into the mainstream, and I think it might not be a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think, you've heard from the panelists up here that there are different solutions for students who are 40 years old, for students that are in high school, and these are all sort of ways that are going to help reduce the student debt in general. Whether these are scalable to the entire system, I don't know, but I think the more work that people are doing and trying to make these sort of better opportunities for students, I think will benefit everyone as a whole.
Chris?
I don't know the number for SNHU overall. At College for America, just because of this employer model that we have, I think only 15% of our students have any federal financial aid, and it's pretty small.
Ashley, how are we doing on time? Do we have a few more minutes? 15? Okay, great. So it's college admission season, or it's getting close to college admission season. Many seniors are preparing to make their college decision. I'm wondering, take off your president, executive director hats, and what advice do you have for a student who's thinking about taking on debt to go to college? So if you were talking to your kid or to your nephew or niece, what advice would you give them right now in today's current environment? Scott?
Mine's pretty simple. I have a child applying right now for college admission. We try to live in our household by no debt for undergraduate whatsoever, preserve all student loan financing for graduate if you want to pursue it. And so we specifically are looking at options that are very affordable from the university, but also have the opportunity to provide outcomes that we want to, that our students, my children want to achieve as outcomes. I will say that we've had this conversation with my current daughter who's in school, who, while pursuing a science degree, she's also pursuing an art degree. And the reality is that she's thinking about, all right, what are the internships I need to get so that I can be employed afterwards? One of the tracks I think have to be part of the conversation with every child is your education track doesn't have to be the same as your employment track, but you have to manage both at the same time, because you should come out of college with the opportunity to actually have earning power and contribute to society. So I think you do have to start bringing in the ROI equation as to, well, what kind of education are you willing to get, and what are you willing to pay for it? Can you do it with no student debt whatsoever for undergraduate? And what is your employment track you're pursuing, regardless of what degree path you choose?
That's good advice. Chris?
I don't have kids, but I have many nieces and nephews, and they always ask this. And it's not that socially acceptable, but, you know, consider these other options. Take classes online, reduce your, can you finish in 3 years? We actually, at SNHU, have a 3-year business program. Can you take some online classes during the summer? Can you go to community college for 2 years? They don't necessarily want to do that. If their friends aren't, depends on what their friends are doing.
Yeah.
it
How
seems.
do we
And,
remove that stigma? I mean,
yeah,
there's a stigma, right? You
yeah.
probably face
Yeah.
this, Andrew, right? Or not so much in Virginia. I had one of our producers from Virginia, and she couldn't believe our community college system here in Massachusetts. She just, because there's such a stigma attached to it here. I
Yeah.
think in part because we're surrounded by these great four-year institutions, right? What can we do to remove that?
You know, I think that the parents really have to get involved and have to talk about, you know, outcomes and what's going to happen if they have debt. I'm not a parent, so I'm probably
Yeah.
not the best best qualified to say so.
I think
Yeah.
the interesting thing I would say is that dual enrollment from a high school level is gaining strength. It's definitely one that my own children have pursued. And it's interesting because there's a very positive connotation with dual enrollment at a high school level. And yet, for some reason, that switches when you get to a post-secondary level. I think I would definitely say we have to think about changing that, because there are some great 2+2 or 3+1 programs that you can do from community college straight into your 4-year degree with a 4-year degree granting institution that dramatically changes the cost profile of attaining your 4-year degree. And I don't know why that is, meaning that it seems like that is it the question of the education challenges that exist in K through 12 or in high school that says, well, where can I get a better one? Well, I can get a better one in community college programs in dual enrollment. Well, does that same disparity exist between community college and a 4-year institution? I don't know, and I don't think it does, especially if in those first 2 years you can really have a transfer degree that's focused on a particular program area, but you're also addressing all the general education requirements as well. I'm pretty certain the general education you get at community college is no different than what you can experience
At Bunker Hill, former Harvard professors are teaching those courses.
and especially considering the online advancements in the curriculum and general education too that exist today. We're like, well, can you also accelerate through many of those and completing those courses while then you spend less time on campus? There's no doubt that the push for graduate in 4 would dramatically reduce the cost of education as well. But
And the other thing I say is that if they've determined where they want to go, and it is especially a private, negotiate. A lot of people don't realize.
Yeah.
You know, and
Ask for more money.
I see what goes on at our institution with, you know, balancing the discount rate against the sticker price. And people don't realize, hang tough, they want you, you know, depending on the nature of the institution, but for the most part, you can actually negotiate.
Yeah, I would say, Kurt, the thing that we face most in terms of stigma is the college experience. That students, you know, when we present what we have to offer to them, they say, that sounds well and good, but I really want the college experience. I don't know exactly what that is, and I don't know that they know exactly what that is.
But they've seen it on TV.
And they're willing to pay a lot of money for it. I'm certain of that. But I think part of it, too, is letting students know. I think with social media, that might be changing now, because I think people are connecting in ways they didn't connect before. And I don't think students at a community college now feel like they're going to be disconnected from their peers who are going to 4-year colleges and universities like may have happened in the past. So I'm hopeful that that kind of connection will help students feel more comfortable going to a community college and sort of reduce some of that stigma. I mean, we're lucky that we're in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's just consistently voted one of the best college towns in America. And I tell students, there's nothing that prevents you from engaging with what's going on at the University of Virginia if you're a community college student. And that's really true of students in general. I mean, if you're in Boston, I mean, there's so many great colleges and universities. Just because you might not be sitting in class with some of those students doesn't mean you can't have a college experience.
It's good advice from everyone. Okay. I think we have a couple more questions in the back.
Yes,
Please introduce yourself.
I'm David Percheron, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Scott, 2 questions for you specifically. The other 2 panelists might have comments. Do you use the financial aid shopping sheet And if you do you recommend an amount of loan money that's not the maximum? So that's the first question. Second is, have you considered, you know, if you don't want to be providing loans that are limited to the maximums under federal law, have you thought about dropping out of the student loan program? I mean, nobody compels an institution to participate in the student loan program, and an institution like WGU might be serving their students better if they weren't in the loan program. So wondering if you've struggled with that choice.
To your first question, what we basically do, and you'll hear more about this actually from Bob Collins, who's here talking specifically about our responsible borrowing initiative. Specifically what we do is actually really give information about what their cost of their degree or attaining their degree will be at WGU. And when they look at the total cost of attaining that degree, it gives them a sense of, well, here's the total cost. So this is probably what you should borrow if you don't have any means to provide for it. I think there was a great statement, what's your free money? Or you should use your free money first and then utilize any of the loan money to actually provide the gap between what the cost of attaining a degree at WGU is and what money you have to provide for it. So what we do know is when you show them what it is going to cost versus all the money you can take, they are much more likely to only take that which they need. And so we don't necessarily prescribe amount and say you should only take this. We kind of say this is what it's going to cost. We recommend you only finance that with what your actual costs are going to be. When they do that, they, you know, not surprisingly, they borrow less. And we've had great results in that program. To your second question, I think it is one that's regularly on our mind, but for a slightly different reason. It's on our mind because, in fact, the kind of nature of where we are today with the federal government and the use of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau as well as the FSA and the Department of Education, that if they're the one doing all the funding, then that gives them, they definitely believe that they have a lot more authority to inspect and investigate virtually everything that they want to. And so whether it's your accrediting body, whether you're an institution itself, there was a very interesting thing, is like how many of you are a private nonprofit? People raise their hand. Okay, how many of you are public nonprofit? Raise your hand. All right, how many of you take public funding? You're all a public institution. And I think it goes back to an early conversation. The reason that we're looking at alternative options for students to fund their education is because we don't want more regulation and more policy positions, et cetera, that stifle innovation on behalf of student outcomes and advancing the accessibility, affordability, and quality of education. If that's going to be the scenario that we're dealing with in the future, we want to separate ourselves from that. Whether we have to will be kind of a function of what is the federal government choosing to do, and is that helping us continue to advance innovation. If it isn't, then can we find a self model for doing so?
I think we have time for one more question.
My name's Joey Vidgen. I'm from American Student Assistance. You talk about the non-traditional student, the non-18 to 24-year-olds, and they're looking for types of degrees that are not your liberal arts and things along those lines. Do you think there's going to be a shift even with your traditional students away from the traditional 4-year liberal arts, I now have an English degree, now what do I do with it, and going towards more specialized, more targeted education?
I think yes, maybe both. I think we're gonna see students who are pursuing more traditional degrees, but they're gonna be adding on to those certifications. So there's a big push in Virginia, especially. We want to triple the number of credentials that students receive by 2021. And we're not going to do that through bachelor's degrees. That's going to be done through certifications, micro-certifications, things like that. So you might see students pursuing a more traditional liberal arts degree, but supplementing that with these certifications that can help them get employed and are recognized in industry.
I would just say, when you do, kind of deep analysis of workforce needs and talent needs within companies and cross-cutting skills and occupations, a lot of what you come up with actually looks like liberal arts degrees. Teamwork, communication, critical thinking, problem solving, quantitative literacy. So, it depends on where you're for career choosers. I think, Andrew's comment is correct. I mean, people are going to pursue liberal arts degrees but need more specialized skills in addition to that. For incumbent employees, they're looking for a set of skills that will take them to the next level. And So we're kind of, our programs, our initial programs have been fairly broad-based, but with those cross-cutting kind of foundational competencies that employers really say that they're lacking.
The only thing I'd offer, which I think is a slightly different perspective on this, is that there is a difference in training skills versus developing lifelong learners. I think one of the fundamental purposes of higher education is, in fact, to develop lifelong learners. To Chris's point, as it relates to the skills that employers are looking for are related more to a liberal education and the ability to reason, the ability to actually problem solve, written communication, oral communication, teamwork, et cetera. That is more often associated with degree. That's why we've also figured out that we focus mostly on bachelor's and master's degrees. We do not do associates. Certificates that we offer in conjunction with the degree, because we do still have this belief that we are graduating lifelong learners, and that's really enabling the overall advancement throughout life rather than a skill set. My worry is that we end up with alternate credentials and coding academies and too many of these alternate things that they become very point-in-time skills that you will forever have to be doing them, and you will never stop. And then when you add up the cost of doing all those certificates over a lifetime in a career, you're like, wow, that cost me more than if I got my degree. So I think there's that trade-off as to how is education, post-secondary, being shaped in the future given the workforce influence, general education, liberal education influence, et cetera. What I do know is consumers are being dramatically influenced by the technology we use today, and it is also changing how they are approaching education. So,
I think we have another question. Yes? Great.
Hi, my name is Margaret Mattis. I'm with the Century Foundation. I forget which panelist, but someone mentioned using accreditors as more of a quality check rather than regulation. And one problem I'm thinking about a lot is accreditors, because they are composed of the institutions that they are certifying to receive federal funds, there seems to be an inherent conflict of interest in using the accreditors as the primary method of quality control, as the visiting teams are composed of other institutions or representatives from other institutions. I'm wondering if you guys have thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks. Who wants to jump in on that one?
we do love our regional accreditor. I think that NWCCU is our accreditor. I think that the resolution can be that how do certain factors or different dimensions of accreditation factor into the approach? So are there more outcome-oriented models that have to be in it? Are there certain dimensions that we're not currently evaluating institutions on that will address some of the federal regulatory guidelines to ensure institutional eligibility for federal student loans? I think it's just advancing the accreditation process. I am not a fan of having all of that accreditation process now being under the guise of a federal model only. I think it just makes sure that we have to continue to evolve the accreditation process so that we're addressing both the advancing the quality of the education and the student outcomes while also ensuring that those who are providing the financing, again, the federal government, that their investment's going to be a good one and that we don't have risk issues associated with it.
I just add there, I think that the Equip experimental site that has placed some alternative quality and accreditation providers, I think it'll be very interesting to see the results of that. I don't think it'll replace or should replace accreditors, but some of the focus on outcomes and some of the work that they're doing, I think will be interesting to see how that plays out.
Andrew, do you want to jump in?
I would just say for us as a community college that transfers on so many students, the sort of quality check that our accrediting agency, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, places on us is really important, because without that, that's sort of our legitimacy in terms of making sure that our credits transfer to four-year colleges and universities, getting buy-in from them, whether that's dual enrollment or just transfer in general.
This is great. I really enjoyed the conversation. Andrew, Scott, Chris, please thank our panelists.